The banker on the phone cleared his throat, the sound tinny and distant. "Mr. Anderson, a 72-hour administrative hold has been placed on all your assets, pending a competency review filed by your son George and his wife Susan." 3 days. They'd given me 3 days before they stripped away my life's work. The wind howled outside my city condo, rattling the glass, as if the world agreed with their verdict. I was 70 years old, and my own son had just declared me obsolete. It had started, as these things often do, over a meal just last week, an autumn evening. Susan had been admiring my view of the city lights. "This condo must be worth a fortune now, Howard," she'd mused, swirling her wine. "At least $750,000, I'd bet." My son George, her husband, just nodded along, his gaze lingering on the polished cherrywood furniture, the pieces Lydia and I had picked out together so many years ago. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, a homey scent for a predatory visit. "It's not for sale, Susan," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Her smile was a tight, unpleasant thing. "Of course not. We're just thinking of your future, your legacy." But she wasn't just thinking about it. She was appraising it. And beneath her casual words, I felt the cold calculus of her ambition. They saw a frail old man, a living obstruction to their inheritance. They had no idea about the green ledger book tucked away in my study. But that was only half the truth. I remember the feel of the worn leather armchair beneath my hands as I sat there, the fabric smooth and cool. Outside, the wind gusted, a lonely sound 20 stories up. George started talking about rising expenses, about property taxes and the cost of living. "We were thinking, Dad, maybe we could help you manage things. Put our names on the accounts, just to make things easier for you." He was a perfectly racked insult delivered with a placid smile. "My finances are perfectly in order, son," I told him, keeping my tone even. I'd managed a portfolio worth over $12 million for 2 decades. I could handle my own checking account. Susan chimed in, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. "But wouldn't it be a comfort, knowing we're here to help? We saw you forgot to pay your club membership last month, a fee of over $500. She slid a printed bank statement across the table. My statement, the violation of it was a physical blow. They had somehow gained access to my private records. The air grew thick and suffocating in my own dining room. The warmth from the oven felt like a distant memory, replaced by a chilling draft I couldn't locate. I looked at George, my son, the boy I taught how to ride a bicycle, and saw a stranger looking back at me. A stranger with his hand already in my pocket. He wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on refilling his wife's glass of expensive red wine. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice a low rumble. Susan waved a dismissive hand. "George is just concerned. We can see your spending, and it seems erratic." She used the word erratic like a weapon, a carefully chosen term for a future court document. My crime? A $5,000 donation to Lydia's favorite charity, the animal shelter she volunteered at for over a decade. A place I hadn't visited since she passed. They saw it not as a tribute, but as a symptom of my decline. The green ledger sat on the bottom shelf of my bookshelf, almost hidden behind a collection of Dickens. Its leather cover was cracked, the spine held together by tape. It was a relic from my first decade at the bank, a manual record of significant family transactions. I'd started long before digital systems took over. It was my private financial diary, a place of discipline and order. To them, it would be just an old dusty book. But inside, it held the truth of every dollar I ever moved. "We think it's time to consider a power of attorney," George said finally, the words dropping into the silence like stones in a well. "Just for your protection." The wind rattled the window pane again, harder this time, a frantic, desperate sound. Protection for me or for them? They saw me as a leaky faucet, drubbing away their future wealth on sentimental donations and club memberships. They wanted to turn the spigot off, permanently. I felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. It was a fatigue that went bone deep, The weariness of a man watching his own children dismantle his life brick by brick while he was still living in it. I thought of Lydia, of her fierce loyalty and unwavering belief in me. She would have seen through Susan's saccharine poison in a heartbeat. She would have told George to stand up straight and be a man, not his wife's covetous puppet. But Lydia was gone. The dinner ended with false smiles and hollow promises to talk more soon. I knew then that talking was over. They weren't there to discuss. They were there to announce. Their visit was the ceremonial precursor to an ambush. I stood by the door and watched them go. The scent of Susan's sharp, expensive perfume lingering in the hall like a warning. The moment the elevator doors closed, I locked my own front door, the bolt sliding home with a heavy, final thud. Now, holding the cold telephone, the banker's professional pity was almost worse than my son's naked greed. The hearing is scheduled for Friday, Mr. Anderson. Your son has provided a preliminary report from a doctor I'd never met, a hired gun to paint me as a doddering old fool. Every step had been meticulously planned. They had been working on this for months, right under my nose, in my own home. That wasn't just betrayal. It was a masterpiece of it. I hung up the phone without another word. The silence of the condo was immense. It was a beautiful place, filled with light and memories, but now it felt like a gilded cage. Every object, every piece of art, was something they coveted. My home was no longer my sanctuary. It had become the asset at stake. I walked from the living room into my study, the plush carpet muffling my steps. My destination was the bookshelf, and the unassuming green book on its lowest shelf. I pulled the ledger out. The aged leather felt cool and familiar in my hands. The scent of old paper and ink rose from its pages, a smell of permanence, in fact. It was a stark contrast to the fleeting digital world of today, the world where my son could freeze my loaf with a single email. This book was tangible, it was real, and it remembered everything. I opened it to the first page, my own neat cursive staring back at me from 40 years ago. The first entry was dated March 12, 1984. A loan to my brother for his first house. Every payment he made was dutifully recorded. Then came other entries. A seed investment for a friend's business. The down payment for my own first home with Lydia. And then, much later, the entry is for George. College tuition. His first car. The $70,000 down payment for the house he and Susan lived in now. A gift, I had called it, but I had recorded it nonetheless. Susan's verbal humiliation during the dinner was precise. She had questioned my memory, my judgment, my ability to handle my own life. "Howard, you sent George a birthday check twice last year. Don't you remember?" I did remember. The first was my own. The second was from an old investment account I'd forgotten to close. An automatic payment I had set up a decade ago. It was a simple oversight, but she had wielded it like a shiv. A small cut to make me bleed doubt. The next day, the true public humiliation began. I went to my usual cafe for breakfast. When I tried to pay, my card was declined. "Insufficient funds," the young barista said, her cheeks flushing with pity. The people in line behind me shifted, their eyes averted. I was a 70-year-old man who couldn't afford a $6 coffee. I fumbled in my wallet for cash, my hands trembling with a rage so cold it felt like fear. My son had done this. He had made me a beggar. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot shame that spread across my neck and face. I had been a respected member of this community for my entire adult life. I knew the owner of this cafe by name. Now, I was just another senior citizen with financial problems. I left the coffee on the counter and walked out, the bell on the door mocking me on my way out. They hadn't just frozen my accounts. They had frozen my identity, my dignity. Back in the condo, I found a document slipped under my door. It was from their lawyer, a crisp, formal notification of the upcoming hearing. Attached, with a copy of the doctor's assessment, it was filled with clinical language painting me as a man lost in grief and cognitive decline, prone to impulsive financial decisions driven by sentimentality. One line read, My donation to Lydia's memory had become evidence for the prosecution, but my anger was honing itself into a sharp, clear point. This was their crucial mistake. They saw a grieving old man, softened by age and loss. They forgot I was a banker, not a teller, not a manager, but a man who had built a career on numbers, on patterns, on the cold, hard reality of balance sheets. I didn't see sentiment when I looked at the ledger. I saw assets and liabilities. I saw leverage. They thought this was a battle of emotion. They were about to find out it was a battle of accounting. I spent the next few hours with the ledger and my old bank files, the quiet rustle of paper filling the study. The wind had died down, and the city outside was quiet. My mind, however, was a whirlwind of activity, connecting dates, numbers, and names. A transfer here, a withdrawal there. The patterns began to emerge, faint at first, then coalescing into a clear, damning picture. It was all there, buried in 40 years of meticulous records. The secrets people keep about money are the most honest secrets of all. I found the entry for George's house. Loan, not gift, I had written in the margin in pencil, a quiet note to myself at the time. A legal distinction I never thought I'd need. Legally, a gift is a gift, but a loan is a debt. A debt can be called in, especially a debt of $70,000 that had never seen a single repayment. A chill of certainty, cold and pure, ran down my spine. The foundation of their comfortable life was built on a lie I had allowed, but that wasn't the real weapon. The true leverage was buried deeper in transactions from about 12 years ago, a business venture of George's. One he told me had failed spectacularly, costing him every penny. I had sympathized, offering him financial support to get back on his feet. But the ledger, cross-referenced with an old, forgotten investment account statement, told a very different story. The business hadn't failed at all. It had been sold for a significant profit. A profit of over $500,000, to be exact. Money that was never declared to me, his silent partner who had provided the initial seed capital of $50,000. He had simply folded the shell company and moved the assets offshore, claiming it was a total loss. He had stolen from me, methodically and without remorse, a decade before he decided I was too incompetent to manage my own money. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost beautiful in its purity, but it was only a fraction of the truth. The final piece was Susan. Her name appeared on the incorporation documents for the shell company that received the payment. She wasn't just a supportive wife, she was an active participant. Her signature was right there, next to George's. This wasn't a recent plot-born opportunity. It was a long-term strategy of financial attrition. They hadn't just decided to betray me last week. They had been bleeding me dry for 12 years, and now they were just coming to finish the job. I sat there in the profound silence of my study, the green ledger open on the desk in front of me. The weight of 12 years of calculated deception pressed down on me, heavier than my 70 years of life. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a second stolen, a moment of trust that had been a lie. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had built their entire life, their comfortable suburban existence, on a foundation of theft. My theft. My hands, spotted with age but steady, reached for the phone. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years, a private line. It rang 4 times before a familiar, gruff voice answered. Markham. Mark was the best auditor I ever knew, a man who could smell a cooked book from 100 paces. We had retired the same year. Mark, I said, my voice low. It's Howard Anderson. I need to ask a favor. Something off the record. I gave him the details from the ledger. The Shell Corporation's name, the date of the sale, and the offshore account number in the Caymans. I didn't mention George or Susan. I framed it as an old loose end I was trying to tie up, a forgotten investment from a client. Curiosity is killing me, I lied. Mark was silent for a moment. Howard, you know better than to get curious about accounts like that. This smells bad. That's why I'm calling you, I replied. An hour later, My doorbell buzzed, a harsh, insistent sound. I knew it was them before I even looked at the security monitor. George and Susan stood there, their faces etched with a counterfeit concern. They had come back. They weren't content to let the legal process play out. They wanted to press their advantage, to work on me face to face. Susan was holding a container of what smelled like soup, a prop in their little play of the caring family. I buzzed them into the building, but met them at my apartment door, opening it only a few inches, the security chain still in place. "Dad, we were worried," George started, his voice soft and cloying. "You didn't answer your phone." "I was busy," I said, my tone flat and cold. Susan pushed forward. "Howard, let us in. We brought you dinner. We need to talk about the hearing on Friday, about getting you the best care." The word care was a euphemism for institution. "There's nothing to talk about," I said. "Everything that needs to be said has already been filed with the court." Susan's mask of compassion finally cracked. Her face hardened, the sweetness in her voice curdling into pure acid. "Don't be a stubborn old fool, Howard. We are trying to protect you from yourself. Now open this door." Her command hung in the quiet hallway, stripped of all pretense. It was no longer a request. It was an order. I looked from her furious face to my son's weak, pleading one. He was a passenger in his own life, and she was the one at the wheel. "No," I said, and with that single word I closed the door, the sound echoing in the hall. I didn't slam it. I closed it with a quiet finality that was more insulting than any shout. I leaned against the cool wood, listening to their indignant whispers before the sound of the elevator took them away. The silence that followed was a victory. My phone rang again. It was Mark. His voice was different, stripped of its earlier gruffness and now tight with urgency. "Howard, I pulled some strings. This wasn't just a one-time payment into that account. It's a trust, and it's been making regular monthly payouts for over 11 years. Significant ones." My blood ran cold. This was deeper than I ever imagined. "Payouts to whom?" I asked, already fearing the answer I would receive. "Not to your son," Mark said, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. "The beneficiary is a trust registered to a Susan K. Vogel." My mind raced. Vogel. That was Susan's maiden name. It wasn't George's betrayal with his wife as a passenger. It was hers. She was the architect of this entire scheme. George wasn't just a puppet. He was the first victim, a willing pawn in her long and patient game. My son had sold his own father for a woman who was playing them both. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had proof of a massive, long-term fraud. I had a weapon that could not only stop the competency hearing, but could land them in prison. And I couldn't do a single thing about it. My accounts were frozen. I couldn't hire a lawyer. I couldn't even pay for a private investigator to gather more evidence. I was trapped in my luxury condo with a truth nobody would ever hear. For the first time, I felt the chilling possibility that they might actually win. I had less than 48 hours until the hearing. The walls of the condo, usually a comfort, now felt like they were closing in. I walked to the window, looking down at the river of headlights on the street below. Each car was a person going somewhere, living their life, while mine had ground to a halt. The city was alive with energy, and I was a ghost in my own home, a prisoner of my son's ambition and my daughter-in-law's greed. And then I remembered Lydia. Not just her memory, but her practicality. We were sitting in this very room years ago, during a market downturn. "You have your bank, Howard," she'd said, touching my arm. "But a person should always have something tucked away for a true storm. Something the banks don't know about. Something tangible." I had dismissed it as romantic nonsense at the time. But now, her words came back to me as a lifeline. The safe deposit box. My heart hammered against my ribs. I went to the bookshelf, not for the ledger this time, but for a worn volume of Shakespeare sonnets that Lydia used to read aloud. I ran my fingers along the inside of the spine, feeling for the small bump. There it was. I carefully worked it loose. A small, ornate, old-fashioned key. The key to our safe deposit box at a different bank, one I hadn't set foot in for 20 years. An account that existed before digital records were standard. The next morning, I was out the door at dawn. The autumn air was crisp and bit at my cheeks. I had a handful of cash in my pocket, enough for the bus. Standing at the bus stop, surrounded by people on their way to work, was a humbling experience. But the shame I felt at the cafe was gone, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. The rhythmic groan and hiss of the bus brakes was the sound of my life starting to move again, inch by painful inch. The downtown bank branch was an old institution, all marble and brass. It felt like stepping back in time. I approached the vault with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The manager, a young man who looked like he was still in high school, was skeptical. He had to cross-reference my old signature card from a microfiche reader, the machine humming in the quiet of the vault's antechamber. He finally nodded, his professional skepticism giving way to grudging respect for the bank's old ways. He led me into the vault. The air was cold and still, smelling faintly of metal and old paper. My box was in the bottom row, number 712. He inserted his key, then mine. The lock turned with a satisfying, heavy clunk. He slid the long metal box out and placed it on the table in a small, private viewing room before leaving me alone. I stared at the box for a full minute, my reflection staring back from its polished surface. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on black velvet, were neat stacks of $100 bills, held together by paper bands from the treasury. I counted out $12,500, Lydia's storm fund, but beneath the cash was a thick manila envelope. Inside was not a deed, but something far more valuable. It was the original loan agreement for George's $50,000 seed money for his failed business, an agreement I had drafted myself, making me a majority partner, not just a lender. This changed everything. I wasn't just a victim of fraud. I was the 60% owner of a company that had been sold for $500,000. He hadn't just stolen from his father. He had stolen from his business partner. The document was notarized, legally ironclad. It had been Lydia's idea. Always put it in writing, Howard, she had insisted. Business is business, even with family. Her foresight, her quiet wisdom, reached across the years to hand me the perfect weapon. Tucked into the agreement was a small note in her elegant script. For a real storm, not just a rainy day. I always believed in your judgment, but I never fully trusted his. The words were a gut punch, a sad acknowledgement of the son she knew better than I did. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring her memory, her fierce, protective love. I carefully placed the documents in my briefcase and walked out of the vault. With the cash in my pocket, I was no longer powerless. I took a taxi, a small, satisfying luxury, not to my condo, but to the address Mark had given me over the phone. It was a skyscraper of mirrored glass that reflected the clouds scudding across the autumn sky. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate power. I was here to see Eleanor Albright, a litigator known less for her subtlety and more for her skill with a sledgehammer. Her office, unlike the lobby, was spare and functional. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of coiled impatience. She didn't offer coffee or pleasantries. Markham said it was urgent, she stated, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. He also said you were one of the smartest men he ever knew. Don't waste my time with emotion. Give me the facts. Her directness was bracing, like a splash of cold water. So I did. I laid out every detail with the dispassionate precision of a banker auditing a failed company. The competency hearing, the frozen accounts, the public humiliation. Then I presented the evidence. Copies of the ledger pages detailing the house loan and the original, notarized partnership agreement from the safe deposit box. I detailed the shell company and the trust in Susan's maiden name. I spoke for 15 minutes without interruption. Miss Albright listened, her gaze fixed on the partnership agreement. She turned the thick paper over in her hands, her fingers tracing the notary's seal. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city traffic far below. She read every line, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished, the silence stretched, thick with tension. I had placed my entire life, Lydia's legacy, in this stranger's hands. Finally, she looked up at me, and for the first time, a flicker of something that looked like predatory delight appeared in her eyes. A small, sharp smile cut across her face. "Mr. Anderson, your son and his wife have made a grave tactical error," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "They've mistaken a retired lion for a house cat. This isn't a family dispute over a condo anymore. This is grand larceny, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty." She leaned forward, tapping the partnership agreement with a manicured finger. "The competency hearing is Friday morning. We will not be asking for a dismissal." Her smile widened. "We will be presenting this as evidence in a countersuit that I will file tomorrow. We're going to lock in there and burn their entire world to the ground right in front of the judge. And they are the ones who handed us the matches and the gasoline." Leaving Eleanor Albright's office, the city air felt different. The autumn wind was no longer a lonely, howling thing, but a crisp, clean current carrying me forward. I wasn't just a 70-year-old man fighting for his dignity anymore. I was a plaintiff in a multi-million-dollar fraud case, armed with 40 years of meticulous records, and a lawyer who sharpened her teeth on men like my son. The concrete and steel of the city no longer felt oppressive. They felt like an arena. That evening, the inevitable call came. It was George. His voice, stripped of its condescending calm, was thin and reedy with panic. "Dad, what is this? We just got a notice from a lawyer. A countersuit. Fraud. What did you do?" The question was so absurd, so perfectly illustrative of his own warped reality, that I almost laughed. "I did what any prudent banker would do, George. I reviewed my assets. It turns out you are one of them." Suddenly, Susan was on the line, her voice a shriek of pure distilled rage. "You senile old fool, you will regret this. We were trying to help you, and you bring this insanity? We will prove you're incompetent. We will have you committed." The threats were empty now, the desperate flailing of a cornered animal. The mask was not just off, it had been vaporized. I held the phone away from my ear, letting her fury spend itself against the quiet calm of my living room. "The hearing is in 36 hours, Susan," I said into the silence when she finally paused for breath. "Tell your lawyer to be prepared." I hung up the phone. I walked over to the mantelpiece and looked at the silver-framed photograph of Lydia. She was smiling, her eyes full of the life and light they had tried to extinguish in me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rectifying a balance sheet that had been criminally unbalanced for far too long. The morning of the hearing, the sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, and the air was cold enough to see my breath. I dressed carefully in my best suit, a dark charcoal wool I hadn't worn since Lydia's funeral. It felt different today. Not a garment of mourning, but armor. I made a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, the familiar routine a steadying anchor. My briefcase sat on the dining table. Inside, nestled between legal documents, was the old green ledger. I had arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early. The cavernous, marble lobby amplified every footstep into an echo. I saw them across the hall, huddled with a man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit. George looked pale and sick, his eyes darting around nervously. Susan was rigid with fury, her posture screaming indignation. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. They looked like what they were, common criminals, waiting for their arraignment. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with the smell of old wood polish and anxious sweat. It was a sterile, impersonal arena, a far cry from the intimate setting of my dining room where their betrayal had first taken root. Eleanor Albright was already there, a portrait of serene confidence. She gave me a curt, reassuring nod. I sat down, placed my briefcase beside me, and felt a profound sense of calm. The numbers were on my side. The truth was on my side. Their lawyer, a man named Peterson, began first. His voice was smooth, painting a sorrowful picture of a beloved father lost to the fog of age. "Mr. Anderson has become prone to erratic behavior, to fiscal impulsiveness," he intoned, gesturing toward me with theatrical pity. "His family, his son and daughter-in-law, have stepped in only to protect him from himself." He cited the charitable donation, the forgotten club membership, the duplicate check. He presented their case with polished sincerity. He entered the hired doctor's report into evidence. The judge, a woman with a stern, impassive face, read it without comment. I could feel the weight of the court's gaze on me, the silent judgment. For a fleeting moment, I felt the flicker of the helplessness they had intended for me. In their narrative, I was already gone, a ghost in a machine, a signature to be forged, an asset to be liquidated. They had almost succeeded. Then Eleanor Albright rose. She moved to the lectern with an unhurried, deliberate grace that commanded the room's attention. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and sharp as breaking glass. "Mr. Peterson has painted a compelling portrait of familial concern. It is, however, a work of fiction. The plaintiff's competency is not in question today, and this petition is a malicious, fraudulent attempt to silence a man who is about to expose a decade-long criminal enterprise." A shocked murmur went through the small gallery. Peterson shot to his feet, objecting, but the judge silenced him with a wave of her hand. "Proceed, Ms. Albright." Eleanor smiled grimly. "With pleasure, Your Honor. We are filing a countersuit this morning against George and Susan Anderson for breach of fiduciary duty, wire fraud, and grand larceny totaling over $1.2 million, plus punitive damages." She placed the thick document on the clerk's desk with a heavy thud. The judge's eyes widened. She picked up the countersuit. George's face had gone from pale to ashen. Susan stared at Eleanor, her mouth slightly agape, the sheer audacity of the counterattack leaving her momentarily speechless. Their lawyer looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The entire narrative, the entire foundation of their legal attack, had just been blown to pieces in less than 30 seconds. "The basis for our suit begins here," Eleanor continued, producing the notarized partnership agreement from the safe deposit box. "This document proves Mr. Anderson was the majority partner in a business his son sold for over $500,000, a sale from which Mr. Anderson never received his rightful 60% share." She handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The room was utterly silent as the judge examined the old, damning paper. "Furthermore," Eleanor said, her voice rising with controlled power, "we have evidence that the proceeds were laundered through an offshore trust." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "A trust established in the Cayman Islands, under the name Susan K. Vogel." Susan made a small, strangled noise, the sound of a carefully constructed world imploding. George turned to look at his wife, a dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. He had been played just as much as I had. "And finally, Your Honor, to establish a pattern of financial deception, we have Mr. Anderson's personal ledger." Eleanor gestured to me. "A meticulous record kept for 40 years. She had me verify my own handwriting, my system of notation. I explained the entry for the $70,000 down payment on their house, clearly marked as a loan, not a gift. Every word I spoke was calm, clear, and precise. I was not a confused old man. I was their banker, and I was calling in their decks." The judge looked up from the documents, her gaze settling on George and Susan. It was a look of such profound contempt that it seemed to physically pin them to their seats. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "given the evidence presented, this court is dismissing your petition for guardianship with prejudice. Moreover, I am issuing an immediate freeze on all known assets, both personal and corporate, belonging to Mr. and Mrs. George Anderson, pending a full criminal investigation." Susan let out a sharp cry, a sound between a sob and a scream. George just stared at me, his face a mask of utter ruin. The trap they had so carefully constructed for me had just snapped shut on them instead. The swift, brutal efficiency of the reversal was absolute. They had walked into this room as predators, intending to pick my bones clean. They would be leaving as defendants, stripped of everything. I watched them for a moment, not with triumph, but with the detached interest of a banker closing a bad account. All the years of their lies, their casual cruelty, their bottomless greed, had led to this single, ignominious point in time. The ledger had done its job. It had balanced the books. There was nothing more to say. Lydia's memory had been honored. Her faith in me, and her quiet distrust of him, had been vindicated. In the stunned silence, I reached down and picked up the green ledger. The worn leather felt solid and real in my hands. It was a simple object, a relic from another time, but it held the weight of a lifetime of truth. I placed it carefully back into my briefcase, the contents now priceless. Eleanor gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. The battle was over. The war was won. I snapped the two brass latches on my briefcase shut. The sharp, metallic clicks were the only sounds in a silent courtroom. Without a glance back at my son or the woman who had destroyed him, I stood up and walked toward the exit. My steps were steady and even on the polished floor. I pushed open the heavy courtroom door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the wreckage of their lives behind me.